Give me my iPad right there. This one? Yeah. Perfect. Thank you. All right, man.
It's on?
It's on. Let me blast out. Put the link in here.
Blast will be a key word. Blast out.
Let me blast it out.
Mm-hmm.
Man, if folks only knew the sorcery that I had to go through to get this one to work today, boy. Sometimes the jinn is something else in here, man. It just really wants to be mischievous.
Right. That is true.
Okay. And then I'm just going to let the good folks of the internets know here. So while I'm doing that, why don't you, episode 25, Middle Ground Podcast. I gave this one the title of Sound Belief.
Okay.
Because, we're going to talk about sound and belief.
That's right.
But not in the way that people, they tend to think about sahih, like the hadith is sound or the aqidah is sahiha, but not that we're not saying that, but today it's going to be a little different. What are we doing today?
Megahertz.
Oh, here we go.
We'll be talking about hertz,
Let me see if I can
frequency.
get your man Terrence on the line.
Yeah, there we go. Or even Tesla. Get him back here. Yeah, so there's, I would say, what's been popularized or trending for a few years now, up to date, this idea of vibration and frequency. And before we get into a quote here, I rather quote the Quran, and we'll run back to this verse. And this verse is 1167, Surah Hud. And in some of the translations, you might hear the word blast or shout or scream. But Allah mentions that, and the blast overtook those who had been doing evil or were evildoers, and they lay lifeless in their very homes on the ground. And so there's many different translations in this. Like I said, this scream had seized them. I think there was even this idea of an earthquake that shook, but it made this sound, this harsh blast. So there's something to be said about frequency and its power of sound. And if we're measuring it in hertz,
it hurts.
it can hurt. However, there's some healing frequencies as well, right?
Yes.
And all of this to kind of bring it to light that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran has everything's there. So we don't need to go into, the woo-woo factory and it's some mystery.
That's what folks want.
Yeah, they love
want,
it.
folks like
Mystify
the
me,
woo-woo.
man.
Yeah, they love it, man. They want to know what Mercury is doing,
Yeah.
where's Venus at.
However, to quote Nikolai Tesla, he had stated that if you want to find the secrets of the universe, then think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. So we'll focus on frequency. And we associate that a lot with like music or some kind of tone, which rightfully so. But it's also demonstrated in the voice, right? And that frequency of the voice and tone can have some meaningful impact on our environment, ourselves, things around us.
Right.
And there was a study done by a Japanese doctor. Let me see if I can pull up his name. And this study's kind of well known. where he was experimenting on sound. He would put some kind of maybe classical music near a cup of water, and then flash freeze the water, and under a microscope look at its crystallization. And the formation of the crystals would have such beautiful symmetry depending on the hertz or the frequency of whatever.
Oh, so now people got to go out and get the crystals.
You see?
So you're going to give them no matter what, man.
Yeah. The idea here is that, well, there's some impact that's happening.
Yeah.
And it's measurable. So what are the effects of all of the different maybe hertz that might be produced? And he would use, maybe I think like rock, cacophonic sound, disturbing sounds. And so he would measure those too, freeze them. And those crystals would come out, their formation was deformed. They weren't, symmetrical. There was no symmetry to them. And he realized, there could be a negative impact. There's consequences there.
Yeah.
And so as I was kind of investigating this, I come to the realization that, well, we're like, what, 70% water or something like that?
Yes.
We're comprised of a great amount of water here. So the frequencies that we're consuming, maybe through music or even argumentation, what we're watching, so the visual and the sound, you got a compacting impact there, compounding impact. What is that doing to us as water, right?
Right.
And then, the stream of thought goes on. And so then if the latter is true, negative hertz or frequency,
yeah,
then what is the Quran doing?
And that's kind of like the verse. It's like the other verse where Allah Ta'ala mentions وَجَعَلْنَا. So instead of khalaqa, which is the verb for to create, Allah uses another verb, ja'ala. Ja'ala means to make. So create, make. I mean, obviously both of these refer to Allah Ta'ala as the creator, but there is also a different type of you could say, not so much a different intentionality, but to make it so in a way otherwise that it would not be. So Allah Ta'ala says, for instance, وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ, right? كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. And we made everything that would be living from water, right? Everything living will have some association, relationship, and will be comprised of water somewhere, in there.
Yeah.
وَجَعَلْنَا مِنَ الْمَاءِ كُلَّ شَيْءٍ حَيٍّ. It's a really astounding verse.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. So Dr. Emoto, and we'll provide these links because they're very interesting documentaries. I believe he had an assistant who was Muslim or Arab, and he said, hey, well, why don't we test the Zamzam water and just see what it's comprised of? And
what's Zamzam? Because people, it's not Evian.
It's not Evian.
It's not Perrier.
This is the well in the present day Saudi Arabia or the Arabian Peninsula, and this would be in the area of Mecca. And this is detailed extensively in the Quran, but you would see this in the Bible as well, where Hajar and Ismail were left by Abraham, and she was concerned there was no food, no water out in the desert. They were left there in the region of Mecca, and by the grace of God, Jibril had caused the baby, or by the baby, this little water to come up, sprout up, and
it's not little because it's still running today,
right? So in and of itself is a miracle. There's been many studies on it, if you will, scientifically, but that water is not associated with any other well or aquifer around the region. While there might be plenty of aquifers in that area, that aquifer was created by Allah by itself as a miracle to stand alone. And the water in and of itself is very interesting, potassium, sodium, all the things you might need to rejuvenate the body when you're sweating or being out in the desert.
Yes.
So its chemical makeup is very interesting, unlike any other aquifer in the region. So there was a sample sent. This scientist, they freeze it, and he's having trouble freezing it. It just won't freeze. So he keeps diluting it to a point where it can finally freeze. Because he was having trouble to freeze it in the flash freeze mode. It wasn't happening. Interesting. So he finally was able to freeze it, and we'll provide the links. And he said, there's only like one crystal that came from it, or actually two, one on top of the other. And so his assistant said, well, that's interesting because the well is called Zam Zam, as in two. There's a binary phrase there or wording.
It repeats itself,
right?
Yeah, right.
Yeah, Zam Zam repeats itself, and so these two crystals are on top of each other, combined as binary. But what's more profound, and they were beautiful crystals, is that some of the scholars were tasked to give a recitation of the Quran, send it over to this Japanese doctor, and have that recited over water, plain water. So that was done. Now, in the document, I have to give a side note here. What's interesting is that in the documentary that you'll find on YouTube, they're not going to mention anything about the Quran. You're going to have to find it like from a Muslim
perspective
documentary. Yeah, right. Like whoever, that's how I found it. Well, actually, my wife told me about it first. She goes, "Oh no, they'll cut that out. You're never going to hear this." So what happens? They recite the Quran, or it's played back on the water. They flash freeze it, and the doctor admits, he goes, "I've never seen any crystallization so beautiful like this before. It's amazing." Of course, they're going to cut that out. We don't give no validity to the Quran and its beautiful recitation and its healing, qualities, right? So we know, or some people may know, that maybe aunties or older women of the Ummah and men will recite on the water, and then say drink it, or they might splash it around, because now there's some blessing or blessed quality to it potentially by the recitation
there's
of the Quran.
a hadith. There are statements from the Prophet ﷺ that talk about when you drink, to make dua, and make dua for what you like, and so on and so on. So there is, right. What's interesting is actually, so Zamzam, so the vast majority of words in Arabic have what we call like a trilateral root. They're thulathiyun, like af'al thulathiyya. They have three letters in their root, right? Okay. So masjid has seen, Jim and Del, right? So related to the act of prostration, right? So that's why a mosque or a masjid is a place of prostration. So the vast majority of words in Arabic will have three letters in their root. Now, those letters can be strong or weak. So, for instance, qala or qawl, right? The middle letter is a vowel. Even though that's a weak vowel, it still counts as like having a trilateral root. But there's a few verbs in Arabic that have, they're what we call ruba'iyya. They're ones that have four letters in their root, and they tend to be essentially repeating. So there'll be two letters that repeat as a total of four. So, for instance, earthquake is zilzal. And of course, the act of zalzala, right? So from that you get the noun, the verbal noun zilzal. Zamzama, right? Zamzama can, according to some of the scholars of language, can mean to murmur. It could mean to kind of whisper or murmur, to say something kind of quiet, or also to have like a quiet rumbling. It's sometimes associated with ra'ad or thunder, and that's a kind of power, right? So it's it's very interesting that it's one of those. So you usually in verbs that have that repeating couplet of two letters, right? Like, so it's like the word for cricket is sarsar, right? So sarsara means like to make the little cricket sound,
Okay.
right?
You're right.
Waswasa, that's probably, Muslims will be familiar with the waswasa, right?
Whispering.
Yuwaswisu, right? Fi sudur nas, right? That to whisper. Because if you think about it, what does whispering sound like? So waswasa, So they tend to then break down roughly into two other categories. So they tend to be either those that simulate some type of movement, right? Like zalzala, right? The shaking, right? So they either will be verbs related to some type of movement that also involves a repetition, right? So like when you have an earthquake, you kind of rock back and forth, right? You don't just rock back and that's it, right? You rock back and forth. So it has, zalzala, you have that repeating action. So the same thing with Zemzem is that it is something, again, related to, it can be related to something that produces a sound, but something more, quiet. Like thunder can be quiet. Like a gigantic thunderclap, we would not say this is Zemzem. But like, when you hear the distant thunder, when it's farther away and that low rumble, right? That can be. So it can also be something, as one of the ulama, hafidahu, means Zamzam. You could say, for instance, Zamzam ad-dars. He learned or memorized the lesson. So Zamzam as a verb can also be like hafada, like to, hafida. It can mean to preserve. So, those are all interesting inflections that tie in to just some of the things that you were saying.
Right.
Because I think maybe either for the uneducated audience or like an audience that has no experience with Arabic at all, Zemzem just sounds like, some gibberish, right? No, it actually is something quite astounding.
Yes. Definitely.
Yeah.
So, we come then to the idea, as we mentioned, the ayah, that frequency, sound, you measure it in hertz or whatnot, can have a healing effect, can have a detrimental effect. And the Dr. Emoto, another famous experiment he did was with 3 beakers of rice. So they were maybe quarter filled, and then water was placed in it, not necessarily filled all the way to the top. And he did this for 30 days, I believe, where he would come to the beaker and, they were set on a table. He would look directly at it.
Right.
And facing it, the first beaker, he would say, I love you. Mind you, this is in Japanese, so does rice understand language? No, it understands the frequency potentially, or there's an impact of this sound. And potentially the intent of what's being said as well. So he would say, I love you. He'd move to the next beaker in the middle. He would ignore it. In other words, he wouldn't say nothing. And then he'd move on to the next beaker and say, I hate you.
Oh, aishiteru.
Is that? I was going to say, I'm waiting for the Japanese to come out. Here we go.
あなたを愛してるね. All right, now we're going to get into it.
What is love? How do you say love?
The word I, like A-I.
Really? Okay.
Oh, man. See, now that's really going to trip you out. Like phonetically, A-I, I is love.
Oh.
So, aishiteru, I love you.
So 30 days, repeatedly doing this, and what he had observed was that the beaker where he mentioned "I love you" had this yellow tint with a beautiful aromatic smell from it. Very interesting. And the middle beaker, so you would imagine everything just goes bad, right? Like sitting in water, everything's just going to mold over. The middle beaker being ignored, not even mentioning anything, it turned like a green mold. And then the last beaker was like completely black molded over with the harmful word of I hate you. So he mentions in his own words Yeah,
Right? You gotta get the anime
you
voice.
gotta really
the dude always Kireda.
if it's in, that the impact of our words and our frequency of those words, the sound in it of itself, with the intent, can leave an impact. And he mentions, so what are we doing to our kids with these, harmful words or neglect? Not even talking to them.
Yeah.
He said, so be wise and be careful with your family. I mean, this is just an impact of our rise. How are we, right? We're more complex beings. So another fascinating study to think about in regards to frequency and words. So having that Quran, like I know you mentioned many times, it's not our background music. We should be reading it. However, once you've grasped the reading and the habitualization of grabbing your Quran and reading it and engaging with it, have that around the house and playing it, because it's doing something to the being, right? It's doing something to yourself on a metaphysical level that you probably wouldn't even know. Your children, you got babies, and having that being played around them is their first memories of it.
And we have an interesting phrase, you could say, amongst us as Muslims, known as al-kalima at-tayyiba, right? Like a good word, right?
Right.
Which amongst the Muslims, sometimes just to shorten it to the kalima, is what? La ilaha illallah, Muhammadun Rasulullah, right? There is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of Allah. Yeah. That's considered, right, the al-kalimat at-tayyiba, right? That's the good word, right? So saying something good, right? Even the Quran says, وَقُولُوا قَوْلًا سَدِيدًا. Yeah. Speak a plain good word, right? So the power of words, right? The power of kindness, the power of words,
yes.
And
the Prophet said that, right? Say something good or don't say nothing at all. It's like,
say something good or be silent, right?
Very interesting. So there's wisdom behind this. He doesn't speak on his own authority for nothing. Like just to say
that's
there's many layers to our religion that are like we just, if we were just to do it, you would see it, right? And then you would get some kind of ancillary information such as these studies, and then you'd really say, oh, okay, Prophet was really on a deep level.
Yes,
right?
Yes.
We thought we were on a deep level with all this vibration.
Yes, absolutely.
He's already doing it.
Yes.
So the idea then here is, if we are 70% water, in one of the documentaries I was listening to, they mentioned that water has memory. And some of you might have heard of structured water. Structured water is where it's in its kind of more natural state, as if it was flowing through a stream, and therefore all of its the H2O is realigned in a way that is more alkaline, more conducive to a healthy electrical charge for your body when you drink it. And that's, I think, the more sound understanding of structured water, where it has this electrical charge, such as electrolytes, where when you drink it, it helps the blood. Instead of it's coagulated, the blood cells, they can separate, because they should be separated. You don't want to have coagulated blood flowing through your arteries there. And so that's good water will do that for you. What we have in our bottled water today, are coming from the tap, is not that great in many ways. But anyhow, so structured water,
all kind of stuff in it, bro.
And it's interesting.
What's the matter? You don't want to take a sip?
Yeah.
Take a sip of that potion.
Well, nowadays with Bill Gates, the Bill Gates factory, he has, I think they started in California. The poop
Bill
water.
That Gates' one-stop shop.
That
Bill
guy's got
everything.
So we're just recycling, from my understanding, the gray water from the right from the toilet, from the rooter to the tutor, man. As they said, man, it's just getting recycled and coming back into the tap water. Be careful. Apparently in California, Allahu Alam, God knows best. However, so scientists have come to understand that water has memory. Light affects it. Sound affects it, now that we know. The way it travels can affect it. And it memorizes, or it has some type of memory, like a computer, a very primitive computer. It has memory. and it will know its environment. And therefore, if it's bad water, it doesn't know to change because it's memorized its state. So when you change its state, it will stay like that. Right? It doesn't just go back to whatever first state it was in. That's very interesting, and there's more to it. It was a very complicated part there to understand, and even the scientists we're just starting to understand this. I mean, the power of water, as you were mentioning with Zamzam, water in and of itself is so powerful and significant.
Well, it's clearly like it's a molecule and a substance that
it's amazing.
It sort of defies expectations. Yeah. So normally, right, when you freeze or cool off something, it will contract.
Right.
But water is actually quite the opposite. That's why you have to be careful if you take a vessel and you fill it with water and you put it in the freezer.
Yeah.
You have to account for the expansion of the water as it freezes, right? It's a very unique.
That's another
substance.
Point they brought up. Yeah, that unlike any other thing which contracts when frozen,
yes,
it actually expands. And so they were saying the ancient people realized this. So this is one way they would split rock.
Yes,
they would get it to a cold enough temperature somehow. I don't know how, and it would be able to crack.
I'm not saying it's aliens,
but
it's aliens.
We don't know about aliens. So, in this documentary, they talk about monks. So the monks, they do their chanting of Om, right? And so this idea here is they are restructuring the water within them instead of actually doing it on water, like, having a vessel and Om on the water. Rather, they're chanting to restructure their body, they say. So we have the best of speech. So we could be doing that. We don't need to meditate with Om. We got the Quran.
Bro, where are we going now,
right?
Man?
We have to.
I need to get my lava lamp.
You got to get
turn these lights off. Where's Terrence Day at, man? I need to get my man in here to kind of change the atmosphere.
I mean, if you meditate, you meditate. That's your thing. But the idea here is that the Deen is got it all, man.
The thing that we had talked about this too. Which was really interesting. Which again, I'm somebody that doesn't feel the need to justify belief and revelation and the knowledge that comes from revelation to reconcile that with science, because we're constantly seeing in many ways how science is always playing catch up, right, to revelation.
That's it.
But there was an interesting. There was this article, and again, we'll put all the links in here. It's on the website, Science Daily. So there was this experiment that they were conducting. It was a quantum experiment, right? So this was what they called a quantum observation. So we're talking about trying to look at something on the quantum level, which is extremely small, like really, 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 really small. And so in this experiment, they noticed that certain quantum particles, whether we're dealing with like an electron or potentially even something smaller, right, is that they noticed that there was this observational effect that particles exhibited different properties just merely from being observed.
Right.
And so one of the things that they noticed, that you take a certain particle, like, for instance, an electron. At one moment it can be energy, but then it can also change to a wave, and it can go through this changing process merely based upon it being observed.
Yeah.
Right. The impact on it being observed. So I said, watching quantum mechanics states that particles can also have, or rather can also behave as waves. This can be true for electrons at the sub-micron level, at distances measuring less than 1 micron or 1,000th of a millimeter. When behaving as waves, they can simultaneously, right, pass through several openings in a barrier. So it's really crazy.
Yeah.
So my point in saying this is that, it might sound like a bunch of malarkey when you're talking about the stuff about water. And, Allahu Alam whether all of this pans out or not. But clearly, some of the things that we can see is that water is a very unique property. Mm-hmm. It's one that Allah Ta'ala singles out in the Quran, right? So God singles out water in the Quran as a very particular substance that he created and then employed that such that every living thing would be made from water, right? Kulla shay'in hay, right? That's an extremely profound statement. And so what we find is that, and we were talking, it's like, imagine if a particle can change from being a wave to an energy part, and vice versa, merely from being observed. Then one of God's names is Ash-Shahid, right? Allah Ta'ala, God is the one that watches, observes, and witnesses everything all the time. So imagine that if we can look at a particle and it changes just from being observed, which means it's reacting to us just merely looking at it. That's another way of saying observation, right? Then imagine how we are changed and how we can be transformed by knowing that Allah Ta'ala sees us. Yeah. Right? So when we're talking about Zamzam and all of these other really fascinating things, is that what we're saying is that, we've grown up in an epoch or in an era of time in which we have been socially conditioned to believe that science, which is really what the group, the ijma', right, the group of scientists have to say about science, right? So science doesn't speak for itself. It's the group of scientists. And of course, they have their own ascending and descending, power structures. Yeah. And so, like kind of what you were saying right before we got on about Terrence Howard. So many people saw the interview with Terrence Howard and were like, okay, this dude's out of his mind. He's crazy. He's talking about some stuff. And even Neil deGrasse Tyson went through and kind of really, did a number on some of his claims. Yeah. But then you just said, was it yesterday or the day before, some other major scientist came back on the Joe Rogan show and was like, well, okay, sure, he's not a trained scientist. Right. And the vernacular or the nomenclature that he's using, we would reject. However, he is trying to say something interesting, and maybe we shouldn't just throw the baby out, right, with the bathwater. Yeah. I think we've been so socially conditioned to accept science as the only means and the only tool of knowing. So that, and again, science is seldom. Even its techniques today are seldom articulated, obviously. Well, what is science? Science, okay, it has to be reproducible, falsifiable, blah, blah. How do you, when you're saying something about like the existence of God, which is unseen by the tenets of belief itself, so well, God is, you cannot see God with your eyes. Yeah. And you cannot observe him through any empirical means. So how do you then justify the existence of the non-empirical? Oh, well, then it must not be real because we cannot justify it through a scientific, system, right? Which again, science is great. I just flew on a plane, alhamdulillah, it had lots of science in it, right? That was wonderful. But that's not the only reason why it flies. Even like Allah Ta'ala says about the bird. Do you not see the bird, in the sky? Why does it fly? It doesn't fly, right? We observe the bird flying and extrapolate from that certain observations that are reproducible. And from that, we've made airplanes and other things that fly. And that, alhamdulillah, that's a ni'am, that's a blessing from God, from Allah that we have that. But Allah Ta'ala says, that ain't the reason why the bird flies. The bird flies because the most merciful holds it up there. Right? When we start getting down to ultimate causation, the reason why things ultimately are the way they are, why does helium have this number of, electrons and hydrogen has this amount, and gold has this many, and silver. Like, why are those? Who set those numbers? Right. Why are they like that? Right. And so I think, as I've said before, Muslims have to be very careful about overindulging science, or the need to feel that they have to indulge science in order to justify their belief in an unseen God, right? Not an unknowable, but you cannot see God. You cannot touch God. You cannot hear God. You cannot taste God. You cannot smell God. Like Allah is not accessible through the empirical senses that science says this is how you can know or not know a thing, right? And so you will say, Muslims will often say, oh, the Quran has scientific proofs. No. The Quran states truth claims, of which either you take them or leave them. Whether they might be reproducible or whether they coincide with something, measured, right? People talk about like the verses in the Quran that deal with certain stages of embryology of the child growing through. Oh, this is miraculous. That's, I mean, it is miraculous, but not for the reasons that you're saying so. Yeah. Right? It's not. That being said, I mean, I think like the interesting statements about water, about sound, its impact. Yeah. When God says, when he wants a thing to be, there's no he doesn't have to
manipulate
something. He doesn't have to perform experiments and have them pass an internal review board and other things. He just says what? Kun fayakun. And it's articulated as what? Speaking.
SubhanAllah. Yeah.
Even in Christianity, they say what? In the beginning there was the word. Yeah. Right? And Allah Ta'ala says in other verses that kind of, to some degree match with that what وَنَفَخْتُ فِيهِ مِنْ رُوحِي. We blew into Adam something of our ruh, of our spirit. But then وَيَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ. And they'll ask you, well, what is the ruh? And say what? You've only been given a little bit of knowledge about this. And so it's about accepting a set of truth claims. But I think all that stuff, man, with water, the impact, and I think it shows for the good as well as the bad. Yeah. That you're talking about when you spoke to the rice and you said a certain kind word, the rice had what qualities?
Beautiful fragrance.
Yeah, it had nice fragrance, and then when you spoke, omae wa shinderu, right? When you spoke, it became right, and so I think that shows that the insistence of the cult of scientism, right? Because I think modern day scientists are much akin to a kind of almost like a kind of cult.
Oh, yeah.
And an extreme cult where if you don't believe what I believe, then you are devoid of any value and you're an absolute imbecile. Yeah. Where the scientists of before, of which, the Muslims were really the progenitor of, there would be no science today without the involvement of the Muslims. And you have many, many Muslim scientists that saw absolutely no bifurcation or contradiction between believing in God, believing in the unseen, believing in revelation, and then, this great gift that God has given to us to be able to explore the world and the environment around us for our benefit. There was no contradiction in that whatsoever. That being said, though, there's a lot of things about reality clearly, I think what it does, it demonstrates a certain kind of consciousness. You get these guys that go and, they blab about consciousness and what is consciousness. But the thing about Islam, like in Revelation, in the Quran, Allah will talk about how inanimate objects possess a type of conscious because they can be asked questions and they will give answers. You talked about water has a memory, right? The objects that people associate partners with Allah with have a memory, whether that be water, stone, or anything else. And on the Day of Judgment, they will rebuff, they will reject that, and they have a memory of that. They have the ability to respond to questioning. Or like when Allah Ta'ala wanted to give the responsibility, right, to who would carry the mantle of real consciousness.
We don't want it.
And he offered it to, right, the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they said, no. We're good. Yeah. We refused, but man accepted. Mm-hmm. This puts a whole different spin on the world around us.
Yeah.
And what is it like?
Yeah, definitely. This is the idea of thinking beyond just our kind of, to the nose vision. Right. And when we're really engaging with the book and our deen, we make sense of the world in such a way, like you said, the scientists of the time, the Muslim scientists of the time, were really coming to the epitome where I think of their enlightened world, their enlightening around them, which had no contradiction, as you mentioned, with religion, while the so-called Dark Ages or the Middle Ages of, Europe, they just couldn't fathom that. The Christian church was like, hey, we're going to you're going to get whacked if you don't stop talking that stuff. We are the center of the universe, right. And that is it. We don't want to hear none of that other stuff. And that kind of, like you said, cult continued on, it seems as though, right?
Well, there's been a squabble that took place through a certain passage of time between the Christian world and the church, so to speak, and its own brand of secularism. Yeah. And they've extrapolated their squabble to a universal one. And so as Muslims were conquered by Europeans, they've inherited that squabble. And so now you have Muslims coming out that, are very pro-science. When I say pro-science, I'm not saying there's an issue with science as a method of knowing. Obviously, it's great. What I'm saying is, as a means of rejecting certain types of knowledge, simply for the fact that they do not meet the criteria of the scientific method, right? So the easy challenge and the way to also demonstrate that science is not merely a way of knowing, it's also a philosophy, meaning that it has beliefs in and of itself. So if you tell a person, or whether you would ask let's say you ask a very sort of atheistic materialist scientist, is it possible to obtain knowledge outside of the scientific method, right? And they will say, oh, no, if it's not science, then it's not knowable. Okay, demonstrate that scientifically. If you can, that in and of itself is a fallacy, right? It's like a closed loop. Yeah. So that in and of itself shows. Or does my daughter love me? Can you prove that my daughter loves me or that I love my daughter scientifically? You can observe the things that I do for my daughter, but those same things could also be proven that, I feed my daughter. Well, the government feeds people. Does the government love people? I don't think anybody would say that the government necessarily loves people. Right? So if you insist on that, not only just simply wrong, but you're contradicting yourself. Right? You're contradicting yourself, and you're closing yourself off, I think, to really a way. And I think you mentioned about, ancient man. Clearly, the version of history, the progressive version of history that we've been given, is just simply doesn't add up.
Yeah.
How did, whether Fir'aun, was drowned in the ocean or not, right? Which he was. Okay, fine. Fir'aun was the worst of the worst of the worst of people. That being said, ancient Egyptian civilization did some astounding things that we still have no idea how did they do it, or how did the Mayans do it, or how did this or that. Like the version of history that science keeps telling us, well, man is this old, and they did this, and a long time ago they lived with bears, wolf skins on their back, and there's just been this steady progression throughout the ages, doesn't add up when they do things that, if you're saying, well, if they didn't have if we couldn't chop those blocks with the precision that they did, let alone move them around with the weight they did, well, how did they do it? So your science is clearly incapable of explaining. And then they will say, well, it can't yet. Well, just as we say, well, you'll find out whether God is real, right? Just wait around till you die and you'll find out.
Yeah.
You know, so not yet. But somehow we're prohibited from having these beliefs, and yet they're allowed, even when they can't prove, well, just wait. Well, you wait too. That's why Allah Ta'ala says, فَانْتَظِرْ إِنَّهُمْ مُنْتَظِرُونَ. Wait, and, let them wait too, and you'll all find out.
Yeah. Yeah, and so the idea here is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given, as he's mentioned, we've said this plenty of times before in regards to Allah mentioned that the people before you, we gave them great stature, great technology, far surpasses what you have.
Yes.
And you guys, so why are you feeling so arrogant?
أَشَدُّ بَطَشًا, that they were stronger than you. Right? They were more advanced than you. They were more powerful than you.
And away with them. we just.
But the part that I wanted to really highlight that I just found, again, I find astounding, is the impact of being observed.
Right.
Things change from being observed. وَالشَّاهِدٍ وَمَشْهُودٍ, right? Or وَاللَّهُ عَلَى كُلِّ شَيْءٍ شَهِيدٍ. Right? Allah is witness to everything. And I think that, when we look at people that embrace Islam, or people that make a conscious decision to practice, they're born Muslim, but they make a conscious decision to live, as a Muslim according to Islam. What is another way of articulating that? It's like I'm making a conscious decision to acknowledge that God sees me.
Yeah.
And through that being seen by God and remembering, right? So when you sin, like sometimes it's described by some of the ulama, even by the Quran itself, when you sin, it sometimes refers to as what? Ghafla. You're heedless. Another way of saying, like, you forgot that God sees you. And so how do you make tawbah? Right? Taba, which means to turn back around. You turn back around to what? God is always seeing me. هذا كتابنا ينطق عليكم بالحق. This is the book that we have always had that tells the truth about you. And we were always aware of what you did. And the transformative power of Islam is in realizing that God sees you all the time. Obviously, that's good for turning the ship back around when you have been disobedient or forgot. It's kind of like when you're driving and you're just heedless. You got your favorite song on the radio, or you're really feeling yourself, and then
the zone.
you're in the zone. Except that zone happens to be 55 miles an hour, and you're doing 85, and there's the cop behind the tree, right?
Yeah, you come back.
But and that's why most of us, like when we get a ticket. This happened actually. It was maybe like towards the end of last year. Dropped my daughter off at school, driving back home, and I'm off in the clouds thinking about something, driving, and I'm going downhill. And I drive a truck, right? So naturally, you go downhill, you start speeding up, and here's this cop behind a bush. Boom, comes out, hits me, pulls me over, and handed my driver's license, and he's like, "Oh, Manley," and I said, "Yeah." He's like, wow, man, that's a heck of a name. So anyway, we just start having this conversation. And, I asked, like, how's your morning going? And, so he goes back, runs my plate. When it comes back, and he said, I'm going to give you a warning this time. I said, well, thank you, man. I really appreciate that. He said, you were the nicest person I've dealt with all day. Everybody else that I pulled over, they were really unpleasant. But you were nice, and so, I'll let you off. Every time now when I pass by that area, I'm not saying I don't speed nowhere else, but when I come back to that area, maybe there's some water there that has a memory, or the trees have a memory, the truck has a memory. There's some memory that's going on there, right? So when I come back to that place, I go back into that mode of, slow it down. Now, when I'm elsewhere, I'm probably going, bananas. Right. You can ask my wife. But when I come back to that, that idea of being, when you are watched, or like as a parent, I remember one day I got very upset about something. I mean, I'm a human being. Imam or not, I'm a human being. And one day I got really angry about something. And I was just really lost my temper. And my wife said, you should try to rein it in because your daughter's watching you. And I was like, oh, man, yeah, okay, all right. So I had to rein it in because
that awareness comes back.
That power of being watched is something extraordinary, right? When you know you're being watched, but then the flip side is, and you see this with great artists. I was reading a book by the musician Sting, the British musician Sting, and there's this guy that did an interview with him and the other members when he was first in the Police, right? With
Don't
Miles
stand
Copeland,
so close to me.
Yeah. With the Miles Copeland and Andy Summers, right? So anyway, really fascinating interview, and they were saying it was one thing to just have your little, putting aside the permissibility of music or not, right? They were just saying it's one thing to have your little fiddle with you and you're plucking your git fiddle or whatever, but when you have an audience
and being observed,
right? Yeah. And so Miles Copeland he said we got to a certain point. He was the drummer in the Police. He said we got to a certain point as a band where the only time we wouldn't be bickering and fighting is when we were on stage, because that power of being observed by the audience changed us in such a way. He said, when we were alone in the studio with just the producer, we almost came to blows. Yeah. And that's why eventually the Police broke up, because they just couldn't get along, right? Yeah. But he said, when we would get on stage, he said, it was a total different energy of us performing on stage than performing alone in the studio. Right. And part of that is observation. So it can be also for a positive, right? Yeah. So if you know that God is watching you, if you know that Allah Ta'ala is watching you, as Allah says, قُلْ لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا, say to those that believe, يَغْفِرُ لِلَّذِينَ لَا يَرْجُونَ أَيَّامَ اللَّهِ, say to those that have no hope about the day of judgment, the days of Allah. لِيَجْزِيَ قَوْمًا بِمَا كَانُوا يَكْسِبُونَ, so that they can be rewarded for what they did. So, being watched doesn't always have to be in the negative. Right. It has an impact. It's going to have an impact, positive or negative, right? You can change a particle from energy to a wave and wave to a particle, to energy. Being watched is unavoidable. We are always being watched by Allah. It's unavoidable. But we can choose, how am I being watched? Right. Am I being watched doing something good and doing something bad? Right. If I am, screwing up, then okay, let me, turn it back around. And,
turn it back around. Exactly. Well, speaking of observation, there was another observation done in regards to frequency. But in this case, it was in the positive against the negative. What do I mean? So a scientist realized that resonant frequency has a role in, as we mentioned before, this destructive power. So if you ever had tuning forks and you were to, let's say it was, 528 tuning fork, and you had a 448 tuning fork, and you hit the 448, it's not going to move the 528, whatever I said. But if you had two matching, same frequency, same hertz, and you ding one and you have it close enough, the other one will start vibrating. So this scientist said, well, if that's the case, and we've realized that everything actually has a frequency, everything is moving in motion, whether it's vibrating, and vibration is a frequency, can be measured in hertz. What if we understood disease and found its frequency, and then matched it with a stronger force, but it's resonant equal? What would that do? And they come to realize that it would actually eviscerate the other one. It would cancel out the virus if you had the correct hertz.
It hurts.
And it will hurt.
Hurt the virus.
So he was able to, through a series of events and finding the right equipment and on and on and on, which was an interesting story. We'll put that up too as a TED Talks. He shows the cancer cell with the right frequency, and he said it's between 100,000 to 300,000 hertz frequency. I mean, frequency is like, when you remember when you were going in the school bus, that bus, and they would let you hear that.
Yeah.
You hear it now? Oh, okay. So the lower it was, apparently you had better hearing or whatever. You can hear like a dog miles away. Well, likewise, there's frequency we just can't hear. But it has an impact. And so he showed visually how cancer cells and other viruses that were just being shattered like glass. So just like glass, the guy, he can get his pitch up high enough to shatter glass.
Yeah, sure. Like the opera singer can
exactly.
shatter. Yeah.
So actually, I think that's where he was observing that. He said, wait a minute. He can get a frequency up that high, that pitch. He could shatter glass. Could we do that with other things? That's, I think, was his...
and what's sad is, I think, maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. I think it's more the attitude of people dismissing things out of turn because, there's no proof. Okay, there's no proof for it, perhaps, yet. But, and nobody's saying that, if you have a certain disease or whatever, you should forego the normative treatment and just go with some radical experimental wind chime to generate whatever. I don't think anybody's suggesting that, but in one of the videos that when you and I were preparing for this episode, there was one guy that was talking about at one point in time and this wasn't that long ago, there was the notion of continental drift, like the continents moved, right? And that when that idea first emerged, the scientific community, the priesthood of scientists were like, no, that doesn't go with standard scientific doctrine. And so absolutely not. And the person that initially suggested this was, derided and labeled a heretic and an imbecile and on and on. Of course, now that's accepted. Well, of course the continents move. Of course they
We're
drift.
all
I
one.
mean, what are you, an imbecile? Right?
Yeah.
So I think that, as he was saying, there have been many, many breakthrough experiments throughout history in science that initially began just as like a kind of wild idea. And they were explored. And of course, a great many of them turned out to be nonsense or defunct or whatnot. I think what is disturbing is just the harshness today of the scientific community, that if it does not immediately resonate with the frequencies that they tell you are there, then you are devoid of consideration, right? I think that's probably the most frustrating part.
It is, and like we should be seeking truth, and I might be wrong on certain things, and I should be willing to say. So, one of my teachers, he was Shafi. That was his method. So that's how.
That's what the fiqh that he found.
That was his fiqh. But he said, listen, if I find something in the Maliki fiqh that is more leaning to the truth, well, I'm going to go do that. Because the imams, they might have got it right, they might have got it wrong, they might not know how to cover certain things.
And
but
even
I'm here to
the
get
giants,
to the truth.
right? The giant scholars of fiqh, right? The study of religious practice and law, that we call these madhahab, right? Of which there are, we could say, the four major schools, right? Is that, let's say you're a person that achieves a kind of mastery of one of those, the Hanbali, Maliki, whatever. You don't just say, okay, well, I have reached the top of that mountain. I guess I have all the answers. I'll just turn into a force ghost now and go to Jannah. Yeah. No. The major scholars the major scholars of fiqh, once they did achieve maybe that pinnacle, then they will go on and they would start to do comparative fiqh. Right? There's a great work of comparative fiqh by, for instance, the Mufassir Ibn Juzay al-Kalbi, right, from the Andalusian scholar, that produced a work of comparative, right? And so you will also find in virtually almost every single school that once you reach a certain level, well, now we reach a certain level, let's say in the Maliki madhab. Well, we also then want to eventually maybe look, well, what did the Ahnaf have to say? Those that follow the school of Abu Hanifa. What about those that follow the school of Imam Ahmed? That becomes a thing, right? And so you can also in the area of the study of Islamic law, you can also have cultists as well, to be quite honest.
Sure.
And I see them all the time on social media. Hanafis haranguing. I mean, I saw some guy the other day that was claimed to be a student of knowledge of the Hanafi madhab, and he was saying like, oh man, you can't trust a Maliki when it comes to eating anything because they'll eat anything. Gosh. Like this is kind of ridiculous, juvenile
right.
attitude, which is really quite unfortunate. But
so I mean, it's within, it's pervasive wherever we go, and that's what Allah says about knowledge. It will bring you to certain levels of
well, this is why Allah. Well, number one, the Prophet ﷺ made du'a. He asked Allah. He made a prayer to God, saying, "What? Inni a'udhu bika min ilmin la yanfa." I pray and ask you to protect me from knowledge that has no benefit. You also have other communities in the past that were destroyed through internal derision, internal fighting, as Allah Ta'ala says, that we gave Bani Israel, we gave them, Nubuwa, we gave them Kitab, we gave them all this knowledge, except that فَمَا اخْتَلَفُوا إِلَّا مِنْ بَعْدِ مَا جَاءَهُمُ الْعِلْمُ بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُم. But however, they didn't begin to fight one another and cause major rifts and divisions and start to be, and when we say that, they didn't begin to disobey God. They didn't begin to disobey Allah, right? The ancient Jews didn't begin to disobey God until knowledge had already come to them. So, there's a type of disobedience that can come from ignorance, and that's true, and we've seen that, right? People worshiping idols and other nonsense. Then there's a type of disobedience that comes from people that actually have knowledge, but they don't have humility, they don't have good manners, they don't recognize that the fact that, okay, I've been given only a little bit of knowledge, and that knowledge should be employed mainly to just being obedient and not growing too big for my britches, right? So that's a motif that repeats in the Quran, بَغْيًا بَيْنَهُمْ, that, the problem wasn't until knowledge already came to them. Right? And that's where I see today that a little bit of knowledge has come to the scientific community, and now they want to lord and, be tyrannical with that.
Observation, man. When people are watching you, you
but
feel
it's
like a star.
You're too busy now thinking you're the observer. You're being observed. Because as wonderful as your observations are, you're still Abd al-Shaheed. You're still the one that worships, the one that sees and observes everything. Wallahu huwa shaheed. Ala kulli shay. Allah Ta'ala is the one that sees, right? So instead, allow yourself to be transformed by that that observation, the reality of that. Allow yourself to be changed. Matter of fact, you can, in the same way that a particle can change from a wave to an energy.
That's what I'm saying.
You can be changed from a person of disobedience. I mean, you look at, for instance, the life of Malcolm X, our brother, Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X, rahimahullah. This is a person that led a very disobedient life. Crime, other things. And yet, once he became cognizant of who God was and the reality of God watching him and observing him, he changed into a whole entire another creation almost. What an absolutely astounding transformation. I think, some of the I mean, Malcolm didn't even live very long as a Muslim.
Right.
So for me, the part that I've always found most inspirational about Malcolm was that he changed completely who he was.
Yeah.
Now, there were people that will go, I don't believe this is some nonsense. You're doing this for this thing or that thing, and they will be very cynical towards you.
Right.
And don't allow, because they're not the ones watching you. What was that stupid rap line from Kanye or Jay-Z? Watch the throne.
Okay.
No. You need to be aware of the one that sits upon the throne that's watching you.
Right.
وَعَرْشُهُ, right? وَاسِعَ السَّمَوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضِ. His throne encompasses the heavens and the earth, right?
Yeah.
So be more conscious about being watched by the one istawa ala al-arsh, the one that situated himself as it befits him upon his throne.
Allahu Akbar.
But yeah, the power of observation, man, is.
Well, one last observation that I think is important, in particular today, and there was one last kind of documentary in regards to the title was The Devil's Interval, and they were discussing how music in its tuning for today, of today's time, the way it's tuned in a very cacophonic or disturbing type of sound. So, for example, during Mozart's time, the way he would tune the instruments were in a way that was pleasant, and the body responded pleasantly, and the sound was pleasant. And this became the formalized tuning from his students, and it became pervasive throughout the world who was into music. And that's the way they would tune it. And they know the hertz. They came across people of music of the time realized, well, there's this actual overlay of two tones when you would tune it, your instrument, that could be very detrimental to the body. And you wouldn't realize it, but it's harmful. Make you sick, actually. And they call this the devil's interval. So they avoided that. Well, later on, when music became more pervasive, I think this is maybe in the 60s, the 40s, wherever it might be, the music industry was captured, and they said, well, we're going to use the devil's interval. They didn't say it particularly like that, but they said, we're going to use this type of tuning. So today's music now has got this static background we don't realize, and we keep listening to this music on the radio, wherever it might be, and we're being affected by it. And people say, one person told me recently, we were at this festival, and I don't know, I started getting sick, and everyone around me was getting sick.
Right.
And we felt it was the music, like the music was making us sick. I said, that's very interesting. I'm about to do a podcast about this devil's interval, and I was explaining that to them. They're like, man, that sounds right, because I don't know what happened. I mean, we listen to music. They're our age. We listen to music all the time, man, and it's like, we grew up with music. You have a background in music.
Yes.
Is there such a thing?
Oh yeah. I mean, so you have the form of music that we are familiar with in the Western world. We inherited from the Greeks, right? And so we all have the idea of there being an octave, even if you don't know much about music. You have your tonic or your root note, and then you go up, like if you have a major scale, you go whole step, half step, or if you're in Britain, you call it a semitone. So whole step, half step, whole step, half step, whole step. So you go all the way up, do, re, mi, fa, all the way up, and so that constitutes like a major scale, right? And so the major scale is also something you can, not limited to, but the Greeks had different modes. What we would call in the realm of maqamat, or the modes and recitation that the Arabs also had. So for instance, you have like the Lydian mode. And so when you just think about it, when you go to a movie and you're watching a movie and the background music, and there's something going on. So let's say the hero beats the villain, And then like let's you have like for instance the dun 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 dun, like you have the Raiders of the Lost Ark, right? That's gonna probably be more like Lydian because it's bright and it's happy. So those modes and those scales will draw out of you or perhaps put into you a feeling of righteousness and happy and joy.
Right.
Then you have, I don't know if you think of like if you're not old enough to remember, but like John Williams, who of course was one of the great musical composers of Western music, especially in soundtracks. So if you ever watch the original Richard Donner Superman, and you have the Lois Lane theme, dun, 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 right? That is a Mixolydian mode, right? And so that's going to give you that restful, kind of nice, maybe even romantic. It's going to give you a sense of tranquility, right? Then you also have like the Phrygian, so that's going to be like, right? The Darth Vader, that's going to be like the Phrygian mode. That's going to give you this dark, somber kind of feeling. Maybe, or you could possibly even say it's Aeolian.
Authoritarian.
Right? So anyway, you have like these different modes, just like we have like Hijazi and Nahawand and Rast and Bayati and whatnot. We have these different maqamats in the Quran that you can recite, the Quran by. That the Arabs had. And so different areas of maqam, of the different maqam could give you a feeling, like let's say you're going to recite a passage that's dealing with the hellfire. You're not going to recite that with a feeling of like happiness, like, you're not going to recite that maybe in like Hijazi. You might recite it in Nahwand or Bayat or some other mode that's going to, if not to convey darkness, but at least contemplate, right? Whereas you are going to recite, إِلَّا الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا وَعَمِلُوا الصَّالِحَاتِ, like you're going to recite one about, يُدَخِلْهُمْ رَبُّهُمْ جَنَّةً, that their Lord will admit them to paradise, the people that believe. You're not going to recite that in a dark mode either because you want to convey. That's why, the field, what we call, ilm al-maqamat, right? Having knowledge of how to recite the Quran. Okay, yeah, you learn the rules of tajweed, the rules of recitation, so you can recite, the different letters correctly. But like a really skilled reciter is somebody that will know how to evoke a certain maqam. Now, the difference is between the Greek scales, you basically say, hey, we have half step and whole step. In the Arab scales, we have what we call quarter tones. And that's why when you hear, Arab music, somebody playing the oud, right? The oud is like a sort of precursor of the guitar, and it's fretless. So there's no frets. Like on a Western guitar,
it's a fret.
It has frets. So you have very you can you can bend. I mean, that's what the blues does or jazz. Like you kind of like can bend the strings and do. But, you have frets that demarcate whole tone and half tone. But on a fretless instrument, like that's why it's so hard to play like the violin or the contrabass because it's a fretless instrument. So it takes years of practice to know like is my finger in the right spot so I'm not playing something out of tune. Well, in Arab music, they utilize the quarter tone. So when you hear Western music, it has that dun, 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 it has that very
marching
square kind of feel to it. Where when you hear, Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar, like when you get that little bend going on there, that's that quarter tone, right? So, Arab music, would employ that. And that's what gives it that emotional pull, right? Very different than just Allahu Akbar. Or if you're in Morocco, you've been to Morocco, right? The adhan in Morocco is kind of like, man, what are they doing? Allahu Akbar, Allahu Akbar. Like there's no maqamats whatsoever. There's very, it's a different thing. But yeah, though, and I think this is why music has been a contentious thing throughout Islamic history, because without a doubt, so you have many people that They get upset when they hear, "Oh, music is haram." Well, I think that statement in of itself is a statement of an amateur. You cannot say that music without any context whatsoever is haram, because you actually then are indicting the Prophet ﷺ for allowing people to do certain types of musical expression. Yes, even if we say that was limited to playing like a hand drum or certain kinds of singing of qasa'id or whatnot, I mean, it's still what we will call music. So if you say music, as we say, as lafz mutlaq, as a blank check, as an unconditional statement is haram, then you're saying the Prophet ﷺ allowed people to do something that Allah would potentially punish them in the hereafter for. That's unacceptable. Now, if we at least walk that back one step and say, there are some forms of music that are prohibited and there are some forms of music that are allowed, okay, then we're in a different kind of category. Now, the people that say, yeah, see, we've walked it back a step, now it's just Pandora's box. No, and this is why not even in the Islamic context, through much of even the West's history, as you said, they didn't, there was a certain time where you couldn't play a minor chord. So again, going back to a major chord, like whole step, half step, right? You would actually, the third note and the seventh note of the major scale, you would drop them each a half step, right? And so that's what would make a minor chord. That gives you that dark sounding. I wish I had a keyboard. I could play you the difference between major and minor chord, right? But that's what gives you that dark sound, right? Or certain types of maybe a flat fourth or accentuating the 11th or flat 11th of a scale gives you that, emotional bluesy feel. But that's why, for instance, people like Ray Charles was sacrilegious to Black America when he first showed up on the scene. Him and Little Richard, because these guys all came from the South and they all grew up singing in the church. And that sound that we come to associate today as black music and R&B and the black sound, that all originated in the church. So when Ray Charles wanted to start to get a church organ, that's what we called it. It was a church organ, which for Christians was a sacred instrument. Right. You didn't take the instrument by which, again, according to their Sharia, right, the instrument that you would praise God with on Sunday, right, and take that and start talking about, see the girl with the red dress on, shake her butt like all night long, yeah. I mean, that's what Ray Charles did. Right. And, you had like Mahalia Jackson and these other figures. They didn't want to be associated with them, and they never made the transition to popular music because they said, this is the devil's music. Not only because of what you're talking about, the girl in the red dress, but the scales that you're playing. Those are shaitanic scales because they will bring out of people that hawa, bring out of them those blameworthy passions. And that's what we have today. Music today is predominantly in these kinds of modes and scales that incite people, if you're all playing in major scales or you're playing in like like even in a mix, maybe like if you're playing in a Lydian or Aeolian, like you're just not going to be able to make a song that's going to make you want to go out and commit zina. That act and that mode don't come together, right? And so I think, I could go on for days and days and days about, music and music. I mean, I'm not really, my brother is the one that could probably give you the greater lesson because he's a professional musician. But, at one time I had contemplated, a career in music. And so I studied music theory and, but yeah, no, there's no doubt that they considered that satanic, right? They considered those things satanic because they're, and so to complete my thought, my long tangent and ramble, is that you have one group of Muslims that don't want to hear all music is haram, which fine, but at the same time, a lot of music, and especially the vast majority of modern music, is not permissible because of what it incites people to do. Now, yes, you do have classic scholars like Imam al-Ghazali, even Imam al-Shawkani, rahimahullah. So you have, of course, people say, well, that's because Imam al-Ghazali, he was a Sufi. Okay, fine. He was a Sufi, and so you dismiss him for that. Although that's not a legitimate reason to dismiss him, but okay, fine. He was a Sufi, so of course he allowed music. Even Imam al-Shawkani, who many people, even in Salafiyah, though he's clearly not a Salafi, but they like to read his tafsir and they like some of his opinions, wrote an entire work on the invalidity of declaring music unconditionally impermissible. It's a great, I still have the intention to translate it to English. It's only available in Arabic. And in this work, he actually talks about some of the positive benefits that certain kinds of music can have on the human soul and on the human psychology, that it can be healing. Now, clearly, he was not writing a blank check to Justin Bieber and Prince and Michael Jackson, and trust me, like when I go back to my Jahiliyyah, yeah, man, like, where was it? I was at home the other day and something came on the TV and it had Parliament, which I'm really showing my age here, like George Clinton and Parliament. And it was like knee deep. And I just was like completely taken over.
Bing.
Man, I was like, I hope nobody sees. I mean, I know Allah sees me, so I'm gonna ask for forgiveness. But I hope nobody else sees me because I just could not shake it off. It definitely overcomes you. But I mean, there's no doubt music is not neutral.
No,
it is not neutral, and it can have potentially a positive effect. But it can also very easily have a very, very negative effect.
Right.
I know we went a little bit off,
but that's the interesting stuff. So, this is what was. We felt we needed to speak about some of these concepts here because people getting lost in the sauce with, I'm vibing, man. I'm in the vibration. I got my crystals and all the woo-woo stuff. Or we'll go to the other extreme, like you said, deep into the weeds with all the rap stuff going on or whatever type of music we're into. And so the best of the best is in the word of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And in there we find like a myriad of what's happening today.
I've said many times before. So I come from a musical family. My grandfather on my mom's side was like a very talented amateur musician. And then all three of us, I have two older brothers, all three of us had an interest in music. Out of the three of us, myself and my middle brother had the strongest predilection towards music. And of course, out of then the two of us, he's the one that became like an incredible musician, a world-class musician, and a professional musician. At one time, I harbored some of the same interests. And so right out of high school, I started, I was playing trumpet and, I was playing in little groups and stuff. And I had also then embraced Islam. And so, of course, in the beginning, I didn't really know much about the issue of music in Islam because I was very new. But one day, Sheikh Khalid told me, he's like, you might want to, he was trying to be nice. Like, obviously I'm a new Muslim. He's not trying to hammer me, but he knew the dangers that potentially music could have. And so he had talked to me one day about, look, man, you might want to, he's like, you seem to have a facility with language, mashallah, like you already learned Arabic in a couple months and you're doing well. He's like, man, you should just really focus on the Quran, man. If you give it time, it'll replace that thing for you, right? And I was like, okay, yeah. So I went to play this gig. And of course, I went to the gig because I'm a new Muslim, so I got on my gear. I got on like a Moroccan jalaba that I actually got from Sheikh Khalid, and I had on I had the whole Muslim garb get up, and I'm on stage, which actually lends even a bit more.
Oh man, you're jazzy.
Oh yeah, I'm playing jazz. I got the whole get up, man. So the audience is eating this up, right? Even though at this point I really wasn't. I was just kind of developing as a horn player, right? But it really, So I remember we played this set. And then at the break, this older lady comes up to me, breathing on me her whiskey or whatever she was drinking. And she's like, I love your music. And it was just like this cloud of, alcoholic vapor. And I was like, oh, man, and you could tell she was also interested in a little bit more than just the music.
Sure.
And it was just this moment where I kind of like looked around, and some of my friends were in the band. I knew the girl that worked at the door, and I just had this moment where I like looked around. I'm like, here I am, obviously dressed as a Muslim. I am a Muslim. I'm praying 5 times a day. I'm doing this stuff. But this is not a good look.
Yeah.
This is not a good look. And I love, I loved music.
Yeah.
But I said, you know what? This isn't right. The next day, I went and I sold my horn. And I sold all my music. And there's a few times I'm like, man, did I have to go that far? Because there was some there's some vinyl that I had in there, man. That but I did. I went and just in a kind of equally hyper reaction, I took everything associated with music and I sold it. I sold all my tapes, vinyl, CDs, sold my horn, sold everything to do with music.
Yeah.
And I focused on Quran and Tajweed and my Islamic studies. And alhamdulillah, like after many years later, I came back to where I could have my own relationship with music, which is not as open as people. Right. Imam Marc, no, it is not what you think, right? But at the same time, my studies in Islamic law, my studies in fiqh obviously showed that this idea that music being an open and shut case is clearly not what people think it is on both sides. Of either like, oh, we got to fling open the door to Pandora's box, or we got to shut it down altogether and throw it underneath the earth. But I would certainly caution people that music can be, if nothing else, it can just simply be a great distraction.
Yeah.
How easy is it to sit there and listen late into the night, put your headphones on, and you're just listening to track after track after track. Yeah. Now, people are willing to do that. How willing are people to do the same thing, to say, I'm going to stay up at night and pray tahajjud or qiyamul layl or do any of those other things equally in devotion? Yeah. So the thing with music is it can be potentially a great distraction. Yeah. And music can also put you in a context in which you're probably going to be confronted with doing some things that you would rather not have been observed doing. Yep. That you would rather not have in your book.
Hey, frequency is something, man.
Yeah, man.
Frequency is something. So you get to vibing with the right vibe.
Yes, Yes, definitely so. So I don't know how we went off onto that, but alhamdulillah.
Yep. Alhamdulillah.
Oh man, is it time to?
Yeah.
I think it's time to cue up, man.
Cue it up.
Time to cue up the music, man. All right. Well,
let's do it.
I think how long did we go this time?
Hey, we did a long one. That was a good little stretch.
Yeah, man, we've been on this for a minute. All right. Better have mercy on these people and cut out. All right, inshallah. Well, see you in the next episode. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam.
Who are you?
Who do you think I am?
Don't tell me. You're from outer space.
No, I'm from Iowa. I only work in outer space.
We'll do it live!